We saw this ocean bill of lading before, so we're not going to go into a great deal of detail, but again, look right in the middle of this OBL, as it's called. You'll recall from our example that it's 10 40-foot containers. So this is an FCL shipment, multiple containers, but FCL nonetheless. Happens to be 10 here, but it's a single shipper. You'll recall from our U.S. prefab builders company in Atlanta going to a single consignee. Now let's say U.S. prefab builders makes this main shipment. This is their main sale, 10 containers of prefab houses. But after the fact, they have to send additional equipment, maybe some special construction equipment or special mix concrete to put in the footings of these prefab homes. Could be any variety of things. But they've already made their main shipment. So maybe these are maintenance, this is maintenance gear. The point is that after the main sale, they're sending other equipment, other products, but it's not enough to fill a 20 or a 40-foot container. So what a U.S. prefab would do is to contact a freight forwarder that offers consolidation service from Savannah to Luanda, and they will pay for the amount of space or weight that they occupy in that container. And it is very likely, if not guaranteed, that there will be other shippers in that container that happen to be sending cargo from Savannah to Luanda in the same time frame, and everybody pays for the space or weight that they occupy in the container, the essence of consolidated ocean freight cargo. We're now going to talk about something vitally important, not only from a logistics perspective, but across the whole buy side of our supply chain, the sell side, very important financial ramifications, considerable risk management considerations, and that all has to do with the Incoterms 2010 rules. They're shipping terms, and you may have heard of some of them before. Ex works, free carrier, free on board, cost and freight, delivered duty paid. That's what we're talking about here. But any international supply chain ecosystem or program that doesn't proactively consider the real meaning of Incoterms and what it can do to us, or what they can do to us logistically, financially, from a risk perspective, does so at their own peril. It is vitally important to incorporate Incoterms rules into your buy-side and sell-side activities, use them strategically, and understand exactly what they mean. I can't stress that point enough. Why is that? We actually do other training courses, for example, just on Incoterms alone. And to really get a grasp and get some good examples out there in real-world scenarios, you're talking a 4-hour session. So this is a distilled version of Incoterms. And I often tell people in that 4-hour session, if for whatever reason you're only going to pay attention to one slide, make sure it's this one, because it really incorporates the essence of Incoterms and what they're meant to do. There's 3 things that Incoterms do. And by the by, Incoterms are published by the International Chamber of Commerce in Paris, France. They are the ruling body of Incoterms. They do other things too. They govern letter of credit rules through their UCP 600 series. But for purposes of this conversation, the ICC, which you can easily find online, governs Incoterms rules. Incoterms are rules. They're not laws. And they provide guidance between sellers and buyers on 3 key points. Let's have a quick look and see what those 3 key points are. First bullet. So we're looking at the seller's delivery obligation. Let's stop right there. The seller being the shipper or the exporter, to bring together those synonymous terms. So focusing on the seller's delivery obligations. That word is in bold. We'll come back to that in a second. Within an international sales contract, you will recall from both our buy-side and sell-side conversations when we talked about contractual clauses that the Incoterms rule negotiated between the parties is an absolute must as a clause in your agreements. So it traces all the way back to the contract, and in the spirit of complete, consistent, and correct documentation, as purchase orders are generated, commercial invoices are generated, airway bills, etc., the use and application and appearance of that Incoterm in one of the fields on those documents is equally important. We saw that on our purchase order examples. We saw it on commercial invoices. We're hitting it a little more detailed at this time. They govern three critically important considerations, but before we talk about those, let us clarify a point. In our world, certainly as consumers, out buying and selling goods as individuals, when we think of delivery, we're thinking of delivery of physical goods to a location. We buy something online, it gets delivered to our house. We place an order on a vendor in a business environment, it gets delivered to our warehouse. Physical delivery. That's not what this means in the case of Incoterms. It is indeed about the physical movement of goods, but what delivery means is the physical point in the supply chain, and now we're on our first hash mark. The physical place in the supply chain where risk of loss or damage to the goods shifts from the seller to the buyer. That's what delivery means. It's the transfer of risk. It's not the transfer of ownership. Title transfer is a different ballgame. Incoterms do not deal with title transfer. They deal with transfer of risk. So if I'm buying footwear out of let's stay with Vietnam, and I'm buying FCA factory, the vendor's factory, the seller's delivery obligation as it relates to transfer of risk is completed when the goods are loaded on the container at the factory. That's far from being delivered to our warehouse in the Inland Empire, for example, here in Southern California. Delivery can occur at origin or destination depending on the Incoterm negotiated. And there are 11 Incoterms we can choose from. So the first point, the physical place in the supply chain where risk of loss or damage shifts from the seller to the buyer. That's a risk management consideration. Second hash mark, now a financial consideration, and ties in directly to our whole landed cost theme. Incoterms will determine the physical place in the supply chain where responsibility for all transportation, customs clearance, duties, taxes, and related charges shift from the seller to the buyer. Who pays for what as it relates to transportation? The inland freight from Shenzhen down to Hong Kong. Who pays for that? The air freight from Prague in the Czech Republic to Cairo in Egypt. Who pays for that? Customs clearance at destination in Kuala Lumpur for a shipment coming out of China. Incoterms will tell us all of those things. So now we're into that landed cost component. Who pays for what and at what point in the supply chain do those responsibilities shift from the seller to the buyer? And then, third hash mark, in order to make things happen, to make goods actually move and documentation be prepared and all of those things, Incoterms determine the responsibility between the seller and the buyer for execution of certain functional activities. Who selects a freight forwarder between the seller and a buyer? Who's responsible for procuring an ocean bill of lading? Who, if anyone, is responsible for securing marine cargo insurance? In general terms, I don't know the answer to any of those questions. Show me an agreement between a specific seller and a buyer with a specific Incoterm referenced. We can answer all of those questions. That's what Incoterms do. They provide clarity. They provide rules. Now, a quick comment. Everybody knows what rules were meant for, to be broken. So you might say to yourself, well, if Incoterms are rules and something goes wrong in a shipment, goods get stolen, they get rained on, cartons are crushed, how do you enforce that rule between two parties in two different countries? Here's the answer, and the tie back to international sales contracts. If Incoterms are referenced specifically in a legitimate and enforceable sales contract, anything that goes awry with risk of loss or damage, who pays for what, and functional activities will be interpreted and applied pursuant to the Incoterms rules. That's how you enforce Incoterms. You never want to find yourself in a situation where you're going to arbitration with a vendor overseas, or you're in court in the state of Florida with a customer about these issues, but in the unfortunate situation where you need to be either a plaintiff or a defendant you need to be able to substantiate whatever claims you have. If it's related to risk, transfer of risk, who pays for what, and certain functional obligations, the way you do that is by including Incoterms in your contract. So we took a few minutes on this slide, but this is the essence of Incoterms, the resonance of which will find its way up and down the supply chain over and over and over again.